Hi, welcome to Surviving Election Season. My name is Steve Trush. I am a research fellow at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, as well as the interim director of the Citizen Clinic. And what is the Citizen Clinic? We are the world's first public interest digital security clinic here at the University of California, Berkeley, specifically at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. We are building a new public interest technology community where digital safety is part of the foundation of civil society. We are empowering the organizations that we partner with to use technology to fulfill their missions, defend against digital threats, and really build their capabilities. We also are serving as a model for other universities to replicate because we are building kind of the next generation of technology leaders by training students from multiple disciplines, technology, law, public policy, social sciences, journalism, and they come together to strengthen and support real nonprofits using digital safety practices. We're excited to have our event today. We're going to talk about the concept of an election season. So you may be familiar with that. Necessarily, the election here in the US is not going to end on November 3rd, but over the last few elections, we have disputed election results for either party at federal or state levels, and we've seen increased digital physical threats extending past the end of the year, including past an inauguration. So we're going to, with that framing, we have two awesome co-panelists, Sarah Aoun and Chris Garaffa, and I want to really thank them for participating. Both of them are coming in from the East Coast. Real quickly, Sarah Aoun, she/her, is a human rights technologist working at the intersection of tech, human rights, and transformative justice. Aoun works with groups around the world on security and privacy and internet freedom. She has been a 2017-2018 Ford Fellow Ford Mozilla Open Web Fellow. She currently sits on the board of Internet Freedom Festival and serves as an advisor for GJS Security and the Human Rights Foundation. And Chris Garaffa, they, them, is a technologist based in New Haven, Connecticut. They're also the technology director for Trans Lifeline, which provides peer support services for trans and non-binary people. Chris has many years of experience with helping individuals, businesses, and community groups improve their cybersecurity through trainings and advice. Chris is also a weekly guest on Loud and Clear with Brian Becker, with a weekly segment on how monopoly corporations in the national surveillance state are threatening church freedoms, civil rights, and civil liberties. They're also a frequent guest on By Any Means Necessary, The Critical Hour in People's Republic. Sarah and Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to share anything more about your current role and or recent initiatives you have going on?
Thanks, Steve, for the introduction. And hey, Chris, I'm happy to be on this panel with you. Thank you for the introduction. That was pretty much like what I'm up to these days. In short, essentially, I work on security and privacy with human rights defenders, activists, lawyers, and journalists in the US and abroad, a lot in the Middle East, which is where I'm from. And currently, I am the chief technologist at the Open Technology Fund, which is an organization that funds internet freedom projects and technologies and research, such as, say, Tor, if you've ever used Tor, or WireGuard or Signal back in the days. But I'm currently here basically as just like on separate from my work at the OTF, which is definitely more international, but just speaking from experience from a personal perspective of working in the US and working with organizations in the US that have been targeted and that are usually at risk. So excited to share more about this as we dive into the conversation.
Awesome, thank you so much, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Steve and Sarah. I'm really excited to be here with everyone. I came to Trans Lifeline after more than a decade in technology, tech support development, but I really got excited about security. I tried running my own web development freelancing gig for a while, but it turns out I'm actually really bad at business. So, I came to Trans Lifeline 2 years ago as the organization's first technology director. If I can just introduce who we are. Trans Lifeline was founded in 2014 as a peer support hotline by and for trans people. All of our operators are trans and go through a period of training to be a peer support specialist, not a counselor. And that's a thing that makes us different. We approach things as peers. So we've answered over 100,000 calls since we started, and we're on track to answer over 30,000 this year. In 2016, we actually also merged with the Trans Assistance Project, which is called microgrants. And basically that project gives money to trans people to get their names and gender markers changed on their IDs, which can be a really difficult and expensive and time-consuming process. And trans people overall in the population have a higher rate of poverty than most other groups. And so we help out with that. So my role at Trans Lifeline is to work with the operations team and all of the other teams to keep the technology running, but also to keep us safe. We are a remote organization which presents, and I think we'll talk about this, its own, very unique challenges.
Awesome, Chris. Thank you so much for being with us. I would like to kind of just jump right into our the questions and have a discussion about this concept of what can U.S.-based nonprofits and NGOs do starting today, but really continuing through this concept of an election season. So just speaking with your own experience, and Chris, maybe we can start with you. How does this concept of election season, where organizations should be prepared to address an increase in threats or like a decrease in their own bandwidth to handle security, how does that resonate with you and what you've seen around past elections, such as in 2016 and 18?
Yeah, so we keep statistics on our call volume and our callers. And as you probably expect, November 2016, when we all woke up that next day, we got a huge jump in not just our calls, but also in first-time callers who maybe had just found out about us. And we also got a lot of media attention, and that attention can be good and bad. We're letting, people are finding out about us and they can use us as a resource. And many people, were just in a state of panic, the day after the 2016 election. But also it brings trolls and it brings harassers as they find out about us as well. So the media attention is, has good and bad, impacts for us. I looked at November 2018 was actually not that big of a deal for us. We didn't see an increase in contacts, calls, or threats. And that was the first election that I had been in the organization for. We did deal with a few more trolls, but, midterm elections don't impact our community as much as, presidential elections do. But we saw that huge spike in 2016, and we're getting ready for a repeat. In 2018, what we did see was in October of 2018, a month before the election, our calls doubled over the previous month because that's when the Trump administration had announced its plan to change the legal definition of gender, which would have impacted housing and many other human rights. And that month, we actually doubled our number of calls, but also increased our number of volunteers. So we're able to, community members, come on and help us out, which has always been a really great thing. And as I said earlier, we do a lot of, training for our volunteers and honestly vetting them too. So the election season is just like one area of the political arena for us. And it's, as you said, it's not going to be over in November. It's not going to be over in January. It continues almost year round for us because the impact of the elections really has a significant impact on our work. And I should say at the same time, we're all dealing right now with, COVID-19 and wildfires and hurricanes and this national uprising against police terror. And so much of this has also uprooted people, from their routines or, even their homes. And so a lot of people are also working on, adjusting to remote work as well, which is also an impact as we have more, more pressure on us in the immediate election season.
Thank you, Chris. Sarah, Chris mentioned how they're preparing for a repeat of 2016 or an increase coming into 2020's election. Is that what you're seeing, or what your analysis would be for the type of organizations that you help with?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, 2016, I mean, similar to Chris, I also remember waking up after the elections and just essentially just being ready for a new state of affairs in the US. And I'd already been working for quite some time as a digital security trainer, so like working with either individuals or organizations on improving like digital security and safety practices within organizations, or kind of like one-on-one with folks. And in 2016, essentially, after the election, a lot of cities came out saying that they were sanctuary cities. I apologize for the noise in the background. New York City is very loud, but a lot of cities came out saying that they were sanctuary cities, but also specifically digital sanctuary cities. So we kind of, me and a group of other security trainers kind of explored this idea of like what it means for New York specifically to be a sanctuary city. And we essentially worked with a lot of local community-based organizations that serve immigrant groups, specifically in New York. And we did it in collaboration with the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs and organizations that essentially get funded by the Mayor's Office under an umbrella called the Action NYC Network. And so we basically worked with a bunch of these organizations over several months on password hygiene, phishing awareness, encrypted communication, secure data storage. And we did this over about 6 months, and each organization sent 1 or 2 reps per their organization, essentially to sit through a series of workshops over 6 months for these people to essentially become like the digital security go-to person in their organization. And all this was kind of aimed to explore what it meant for New York to be a digital sanctuary city, and what it meant also for New York to protect its constituents in quite a challenging political climate. And we had a really awesome cohort of folks basically working over several months on this. And that was really to address essentially another problem that came up a lot when we were facing a lot of threats, which was that there are not a lot of people that provide security support and digital safety, digital security support for nonprofits and for NGOs. There's a lot of people that work in cybersecurity in the corporate sector, but there's not a lot of people that do this work in civil society. And that's, I mean, I've definitely seen a change over the past few years of more and more people being interested in that, and that conversation becoming more and more important. Like just recently, basically from May until right now, with all the protests that were happening in the US, I've definitely seen a lot more people being aware of tools such as Signal and why Signal is important and why we should be using Signal. Like all of a sudden my phone is blowing up with like everyone in my contact list finally joining Signal. And it only took a protest or several protests to essentially convince people. But there's definitely like more awareness about why these things matter. But with that, I mean, more awareness also came hand in hand and in parallel with a lot more attacks and a lot more targeting of either organizers, protesters, or really just like folks that all of a sudden kind of started becoming a little bit more politically engaged in the past few years after the 2016 elections. But so we've definitely seen more engagement, but at the same time also more threats from, you know, the rise of like certain white supremacist groups and folks that are trying to disrupt the political system as we see it.
And are those the threats that you'd be most concerned moving forward? Is like hate groups, white supremacists, and what types of attacks do you think an organization might see?
I mean, honestly, it's a bit of both in the US today. I think we've seen since the 2016 election, the government has definitely tried to push the limits of what they can do more and more. And we've definitely seen, actually just recently, I think yesterday, there's a report that came out in The Nation saying that law enforcement agencies were listening in on phone calls of protesters in Portland and intercepting folks' phone calls and messages of everyone that was organizing around the Portland protests. It's not necessarily something new, It's definitely something that the government has done historically in the US for many, many decades. But it feels like the rate of it or the frequency of it is definitely higher, and just people are a lot more aware of it right now, and there's definitely more discussion about it. So there's that on one hand. There's just definitely like law enforcement agencies being emboldened in a way that they weren't before, probably, or maybe more publicly than they were before. And in parallel, obviously, white supremacist groups and a lot of like right-wing organizations that have been attacking and targeting a lot of organizers. So a lot of doxing, a lot of like personal attacks against folks, a lot of like finding personal information about someone and just exposing them online and putting their personal information there and their home address and their phone number, and kind of sending like hordes of people towards that target. There's a bunch of different types of attacks that have come up for sure, but that's mainly some of them.
And Chris, so have any of the things that you have seen been surprising to you? What's the most surprising thing that you've seen as far as threats go at Trans Lifeline?
The biggest thing that we've seen is just this massive increase actually in spear phishing emails. So, targeted emails to staff in the organization pretending they're from sometimes me, sometimes our executive director. One of the ones I remember the most went to an employee who's not listed on our website, but mentions on Facebook on his profile that he works for Trans Lifeline. And somebody actually faked an email to look like it was from our executive director to this employee. Thankfully, due to the training that we've done, I was able to, he was able to say, well, Elena's in the office right now. We don't use email to communicate with each other. This return address isn't right. And this isn't Elena's tone. And was able to identify it as, phishing, but it was asking for, some sensitive documents. And, that could have been damaging if they had gotten out, just in terms of, they weren't finished. And so, and it could have risked other employees, safety. We're seeing a lot of these spear phishing emails come in. We're also seeing our digital infrastructure. I keep track of those attacks. And it's very interesting because I think when we think about, cyber attacks, we often think, or we hear about, China, Russia, Iran, but the vast majority of our attacks actually come from the United States, which to me says there are some botnets, just generic botnets for sure, but we're also seeing attacks just overall on our infrastructure. And when we can, we work to try to, pinpoint those and identify where they're coming from. But of course, that's a major, project to undertake. So we do work on that and try to see where the most consistent ones are coming from. But those are the two things that we've seen really pick up especially over the last 6 months or so, leading up to this. And as we've also had a lot of media attention and partnerships with, like MTV, for example.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you raise a good point around like how ambitious you can be in actually figuring out, who the attacker may be, what you can do about it. I mean, since the clinic has been working with Trans Lifeline, I know you were the only technology director for the longest time. And many organizations that we partner with, they don't even have a tech person, let alone a security person. What are the things that you can do that are within your you wouldn't consider too ambitious that an organization can do, starting today, maybe starting in the next month or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that everyone can do starting now. And the first thing is to know that it's never too late. If you haven't done anything, if you haven't had time or budget, that's okay. You can take some very simple steps now, and it'll help you every day you do something, or every day that you address something, you're in better shape. You don't have to do it all overnight. Two things I would do immediately is map out your threat model. And we do this on a regular basis. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation has 5 great questions. What do I want to protect? Who am I protecting it from? How likely is it that I'll need to protect it? How bad are the consequences if I fail? And how much trouble am I willing to go through with all of this? And just think about it. You might have staff information, you might have financial information, you know, your email, your infrastructure, all of that, computers, and think through each one, even if you don't know the answer. Then the second step I'd tell people to take is just think about all the technology stuff that you've heard of, right? You've probably heard of using better passwords or password managers. You might want to know, like, what's a good antivirus software? What's a VPN? Is it going to help me? You might want to start training and look at the ones that you can do. You know, all right, tell all your staff, change all your passwords. You know, just go in and change all your passwords, make them, you know, this long, and we're going to start using, you know, LastPass or password manager, you know, or whatever it is. Take one step at a time and reach out. There's a community, and I hope we'll talk more about this, but there's a great community of folks like Sarah and so many others who can help with this kind of thing.
And I see we're starting to get some questions in the Q&A. I just want to send a reminder to all our attendees. Start populating your questions here, because towards the second half of our discussion, we'll start getting to those. Sarah, kind of the same question to you. What advice would you have to an organization looking for some protections? And I think particularly, I'm a little concerned about organizations who, you know, they may not see themselves as like a political target. What would you tell a leader who doesn't think that they have anything to hide or anything to protect?
Oh, this is the this is the question, Steve. At first, I really want to echo what Chris said about that it's never too late to start. I often work with people who are quite overwhelmed at the prospect of securing themselves or an organization and don't really know where to start from. And because they don't really know where to start from, they kind of just gave up, and they don't even want to explore that. Thankfully, at this point, there are so many amazing resources out there, and some of them that by the Citizen Clinic that you all have put together, some that EFF has put together, some that a lot of other organizations that focus on organizational security have put together, and these resources are available online and for free. So, and they will walk folks through a step-by-step of how to secure an organization, or at least where to start from, and just the basic minimum. Thinking about your risk assessment or threat model, as Chris said, is a great starting point as well, to kind of get an understanding and try to even know like what you're trying to protect and why you want to protect it, and if it's worth protecting and whatnot. For organizations, there's definitely a few things that are quite easy to start with, and for me are really the low-hanging fruit that will, if adopted, actually increase your security tremendously. And one is just better password hygiene in general. Just making sure, like adopting a password manager at the organization, making sure that everyone is using it, that allows you to store your passwords, that allows you to generate passwords so you don't have to think about it anymore, so that you're not in the end using the same password for like every account that you have, because that increases the chances of you getting hacked essentially and someone getting into your accounts. There's that, and then there's two-factor authentication, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. It's like when you try to log into an account and you put in your username and password, and then it requests like an SMS code or a certain key or a certain code that you might have. And that's two-factor authentication. And so adding that as well on top of your accounts will help a lot, especially with the types of attacks that Chris described earlier in terms of spear phishing or phishing attacks. Attacks that are aimed at getting your credentials, that are aimed at getting your username and password. So if one of these attacks were to be successful and someone were to get your username and password, at least they would be stopped at the next level, which would then be the two-factor authentication. So they would put in your username, they would put in your password, but then they would be they would face a page that's essentially requesting code that they don't have. So that's really, really helpful, these two things. That's really applicable on like an individual level or an organizational level. Generally shifting the culture at an organization is quite hard, and making it more of a security culture, especially for organizations, Steve, like you say, that one, don't have dedicated personnel to work on security, and then two, that don't think that they're necessarily targets or that they're politically engaged. sometimes you're just caught in the crossfire, unfortunately, and you're just collateral damage for whatever reason, or you just happen to attend an event and someone took a photo of you at an event and then they find out that you work at X organization, and then they end up attacking X organization. It really, I mean, like, attacks really happen in like all kinds of crazy ways, and there's not, you don't really have to fit a very specific profile to end up being a target. Unfortunately, like, someone is and can come after you for really the simplest thing, from either you writing a tweet online or having been at an event or at a protest and someone just ended up taking a photo of you. At an organizational level, so shifting the culture is quite hard, but a good place to start often, I find, is an onboarding policy. A lot of organizations don't have an onboarding policy, but if you do develop an onboarding policy that's centered around security, at least you're kind of establishing that baseline from the start. So as soon as someone joins the organization, you're kind of setting the stage and you're setting the tone for what it means to be part of the organization. You're saying to that person, this is how we take, this is how we consider security, this is how we take it seriously, these are the things to adhere to. So you're kind of like setting that person up from the very beginning, as opposed to trying to take like 10 to 15 to 20 people and then shift them into a mentality of security when they've been there for so long. So really focusing on the onboarding policy and setting the stage like so early on really helps in kind of just putting people on that right path. So that's something that people forget a lot, just like thinking about onboarding policies. But it's really quite helpful while working with organizations, and especially those that don't have a dedicated person to work on security, or just a lot of time to do it. But just the small things here and there really make a difference.
Thank you, Sarah. Now, we've heard quite a few bits of advice, and I feel like some of the advice is probably things that organizations have heard before. Like they know they need to do that. But also, we're kind of towards the end of the year. There may be organizations that are in the middle of various transitions, where there's leadership, boards, their budgets and fiscal priorities. Chris, I mean, from your work with Trans Lifeline or elsewhere, how do you actually get these onboarding policies written, or these systems upgraded, and these other mitigations you have to have meetings about meetings, and we're all on Zoom, so we have like a whole day full of Zoom meetings now. How do you get the one block on security?
Yeah, and I want to also touch on something Sarah said about culture too, because this is very related. We do at Trans Lifeline, all of our staff and actually our volunteers too have to go through a 30-minute security training when they start. It's mandatory, and if they don't do it, then it becomes an issue with their involvement in the organization. The other thing on culture too that I want to mention is we have a very open security culture. We actually have it in our organizational written policy that if you report a security issue, even if you gave you didn't have two-factor and you gave somebody your password in a phishing email, you're not going to get in trouble for it. Like what'll cause trouble is if you don't report it. But if you do report it, then no one's going to be fired, no one's going to be kicked out of the program for it. And that has helped people feel more confident about coming to me and saying, hey, I clicked this link in this email, it feels, but then it felt weird. I think on how to do it, I mean, yeah, you have to get buy-in, executive buy-in, ultimately. And then you also have to get staff buy-in too, because if they feel like it's, somebody at the top or a few people at the top pushing this stuff on them, and they're already overworked, they're not going to want to deal with it. They're just going to ignore it. They're going to say, okay, yeah, you change my password later after I finish these 8 meetings and 5 reports I have to do. Showing what could happen, if the organization were attacked, actually laying it out, saying, listen, if our caller database got leaked or the payment information for our microgrants recipients was found out on the internet, we would have no organization and we couldn't do that work. We would completely lose the trust of our community, and rightfully so. So explaining why it's so important, not just that it is important, but what's going to happen if we don't do this, and not in a way to scare anyone or in a way to intimidate them. The reality is we all have to deal with these things in our personal lives, at work, in nonprofits, and organizations do have to actually, proactively taking some steps. This isn't something that I think we look forward to ignore. But again, there are small basic steps you can take. You don't have to do it all in one day. As a full-time employee, it took me over a year and a half to get us to where I felt we were in a decent place. And this is as somebody who does this professionally and was dedicated to it, it's not going to happen overnight, and that's okay. And if you feel like you have to do it overnight, then you're just going to end up burning yourself out, especially if you don't have a dedicated tech staff or support system.
Thank you, Chris. While we're on the subject of mitigations, I'm curious, and maybe I can learn something from either of you, on the topic of doxing. So there's a bunch of different advice from the security community on what do we do with all of our private information that is actually somewhat accessible through Google searches or on data brokers online. How do you address that with an organization? Do you help all of your employees try to clean that up? Is that worth your time as an NGO? Is that something you're going to help people with? Sarah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I love the topic of doxing. New York. I can hear the honking in the background. But Chris said something important earlier when we were talking about risk assessment and threat modeling. Like, one question to ask yourself is this worth my time? So generally, should an organization focus on doxing or not and help employees go through it? It really depends on the answer is always going to be, it depends. It depends on the profile of the organization. It depends on the profile of staff members. Sometimes it's really out of the 15 people you have on staff, one person is more likely to be targeted because they have quite a public profile. So in that case, maybe focusing on that one person is really all the work that you do. But having a doxing policy at the organization is really, really helpful to start with. And that kind of outlines and that's a conversation to have with management at the organization. Essentially, what is management going to do? What is the organization going to do if one of their employees is targeted? Do you offer them relocation services if their home address has been leaked online and they might face some physical danger? Are you going to pay for some hotel nights somewhere until that staff members feel safe or manages to move somewhere else? I mean, there's so many questions that essentially an organization needs to agree on and to decide, ideally preemptively and proactively before an incident occurs. A lot of organizations wait until an incident occurs to start making these decisions and to start deciding what they would do in case that were to happen again. And they do that for all kinds of different security concerns. But it's really important to kind of do preemptive work and not reactive work. And like you say, there is a ton of personal information online, unfortunately, because we have things called data brokers that collect a lot of this information and put it online. The good news is it's possible in most cases to remove that personal information. The bad news is it's time consuming and it's annoying and a lot of people don't want to do it. There are some services that you can pay that will do that work for you. They're also incredibly expensive and they're not accessible to everyone. But what I do personally for myself and for some folks that I work with is that I have a reminder on my calendar, maybe twice a year or 3 times a year, to essentially just search myself online, my first name with my phone number, my full name with my phone number, my full name with my home address, and then see what comes up. Sometimes nothing, and then sometimes I will see my information on a data broker site, and then I'll go through the steps essentially to remove that information from the listing. When you do it for the first time, you might get 15 hits or more or less. But as you go through it and kind of delete all of these, then the upkeep, the thing that you do a few times a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, becomes a lot easier because there's way less information because you kind of did the initial cleanup. It is time consuming. when I've worked with organizations, we've tried to make it a little bit more fun, where we've dedicated like a full afternoon essentially to all sitting together around the table with like snacks and drinks and whatnot, and just given each other a time limit to kind of go through these data brokers sites as much as possible and to try to remove as much information as we can. So there are ways of kind of making it a little bit more interesting, but it is definitely like one of the more difficult things about being in the US and working in the US, because that doesn't really exist as much like if you're in Europe or the rest of the world. But in the US, it's quite difficult. You will see your information on a lot of data broker sites, and in a lot of cases, it is overwhelming. So if anyone that's listening to this talk right now, and if you happen to search for yourself online and your phone number and your home address and you find personal information there, please take a deep breath, because it's always quite overwhelming to see it like this publicly. Just take a deep breath, and like essentially for every single one of these sites, like there is a way to remove that information. So you can just look for that and essentially go through the steps of removing it.
Yeah, and just a quick, so if you go to privacyduck.com or joindeleteme.com, they have opt-out guides on like how to, for the major data brokers, you'll go step by step on how to request that your information is removed. Chris, without revealing any like specific protections for Trans Lifeline, what's your perspective on this problem of revealing personal information and the threats that go along with that?
Oh, it's a huge question and issue for us all the time. One of the things when I'm onboarding new staff, particularly, is I tell them, I recommend setting up a Google alert for your name. It's just like a super basic first step. And if they're not comfortable doing that, I'll say, do you want me to do it for you? And I can keep track of it. So I have, at 1 p.m. every day, I get a whole bunch of Google alerts, with the name of our organization, the name of certain key people. We also don't require our staff to be listed on our website. We don't require our staff to mention on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter that they work with us. They are certainly free to do so, and we talk about the pluses and minuses of that. I'm very open. Obviously, I'm here, very open about my job. But some people choose not to. They have, many reasons not to, especially for trans folks who, their family might not be supportive of them or even know that they're out. And so, doxing for us is a huge concern. We also monitor, regularly monitor certain websites that have been known to troll us and harass us. And, unfortunately, we do that, manually. It's going in every so often and checking certain threads and looking for message boards and things like that. Following certain people or keeping a list of certain people on Twitter that we know we need to keep an eye on. We also, I think they might actually be watching, my amazing IT support specialist at Trans Lifeline, who I won't name for their privacy, has put together actually some trainings. We do a training once, like a open technology training once a month. And one of the recent ones we did was how to remove all of your information from those data broker sites. And we, wrote it up. And they also have an article that'll be out on our blog probably in the next few weeks, I think. With more information about that and kind of going through the steps and how to get yourself removed from certain Google search results, or at the very least push those results down by creating new content. So it's something that we don't want to just educate our own people about in our organization, but we've really started to take a role in saying we want to protect our community as well.
Thank you, Chris. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I like all the advice that we've been talking about. I also know that that there's a reason why organizations like my clinic exist. There's a reason why networks that Sarah, you belong to help organizations out also are needed. If you're a nonprofit, what support actually is available to you, and how do you get in touch with someone to help you through getting some sort of security assistance, consultation, whatever you want to call it? Sarah, do you want to take that?
Sure. So there's some mechanisms. There's not a lot of mechanisms. There's definitely so much more work to be done around this topic. I mean, the Citizen Clinic is one of these places. And I would be very happy, Steve, if you were to share a little bit more about it also with everyone that's attending, because I'm expecting not everyone is aware of what services you offer. But the Citizen Clinic at UC Berkeley is one of them. There's other kind of matching services like the Digital Security Exchange program. Nonprofits essentially can reach out and they'll get assigned or they'll get paired with a digital security trainer like myself. Honestly, otherwise, a lot of the, unfortunately, a lot of the work that comes my way is from, it's word of mouth, because there's not a lot of, there's not easy mechanisms for people to find this type of support. A lot of the foundations, the big foundations like Ford or OTF actually have grants for digital security, but not a lot of people know that. So it does exist, like these, a lot of foundations do offer financial support for digital security. And if not, also a lot of foundations work with digital security providers like myself and would easily make, that introduction or that connection. So, there's still a lot of work to be done on that specifically, but otherwise, a lot of folks end up just kind of reaching out to me and then I'll kind of connect them to someone else, or usually the other way around, like they'll reach out to someone and then eventually come my way. And that's usually how I'll end up working with them. So definitely some improvement to be done there. There's just not enough support for the types of attacks that we see and that we witness.
Yeah, Sarah, that's a great point. So, with us at the clinic, we provide, 18-month to 2-year-long engagements with our civil society partner, in that we have students that do an assessment. We'll walk them through some of these mitigations, as we would say, and we'll also reassess them and see, okay, well, are they actually working, and make sure that they're really appropriate for the context that the organization operates in. And especially, like, there's tons of guides online around how to improve your security, and some of them, are really good. You just get to the fundamentals of locking down your accounts, removing your private information. But when we're talking about like these more organizational policies, that's where it gets a little more complex. Of like, well, how do we actually get everyone on board in the organization to do this? Chris, you have tons of great ideas that you've seen what has worked for Trans Lifeline. Some of that stuff, it's really a lot to address, for an organization that, security is something that's new to them, or they're not getting a lot of external support. And what we've seen at the clinic is that it's been a lot of word of mouth, referrals, where it's the organizations, because they're also letting us in, and we get to see a bit of how the organization operates. We get to, I wouldn't see the dirty laundry, but we get to hear about like some sensitive information about, like, okay, well, yeah, here is our password policy. It doesn't exist, and that takes quite a bit of trust. So having that, like, person-to-person referral system is almost like necessary in some ways when we don't have like a really strong, as you mentioned, network for civil society. At least not what we see in the private sector. Okay, so we have a few questions. So the first upvoted one is, what advice do we have for nonprofits that are experiencing disinformation campaigns, either related to the election season or otherwise? Chris, do you want to take that?
I can try. This, not particularly my specialty, but what I'll say is I would start treating it at least the way we treat harassment, which is screenshot everything. If it's, let's say it's on Twitter, screenshot who's using a specific hashtag or phrase, see if there's multiple people using the same sentences. And you can kind of take an approach to that to get a sense of where it's coming from at the very least. The documentation, I think, of these things is so important. Policy-wise, you want to assess with your own organization if and how you're going to respond. Are you bringing more attention to the disinformation by acknowledging it and responding to it? Lies spread quickly and truth does not. So you really need to have a conversation if you have a media team, a communications person, a board of directors or anyone, and talk about what are the repercussions if we address this. Who is that statement for that we're addressing it with, and how are we going to do it? Are we going to do a big media campaign? Are we going to do maybe cute infographics, about what we do without acknowledging directly the disinformation campaign? There's a number of ways that I would start approaching that.
Just a quick follow-up. Would you approach that with other organizations as well? I feel like a lot of times the communication plans happen almost in a silo where organizations like, we're being attacked with some falsehoods, some lies, being harassed, and we're just going to shout out on Twitter or Facebook ourselves. But if you does Trans Lifeline work with other partners, whether in the LGBTI community or else, to like, oh, we all need to address this disinformation?
Yeah, we're always trying to build partnerships with other organizations. The Transgender Law Center, Lambda Legal, and so many others. And start having the conversations about what are you seeing, not just on a technology and security and disinformation level, like how does your hotline run, how does your system, how do to share that kind of information. And I think those informal networks are so important. We need to find a way to formalize them and publicize them, but building those connections and those relationships are actually very critical. Reach out. We're all trying to do good here. Reach out and see how to help somebody.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on disinformation?
I think Chris pretty much covered everything I was going to say. Everything around like documentation and kind of tracing back like the origins of a certain trend or a certain like misinformation campaign can be really helpful to then for whatever comes next, honestly. And having, in the same way that an organization would have, security policy or disaster policy, but having like a PR policy and just knowing like at what point to answer publicly, does it bring more attention? Does it not bring more attention? And strategies around there. I mean, Chris pretty much covered everything. But there are also a lot of really great organizations that do work on misinformation, disinformation. So, and a lot of them also have pretty practical guides around that. Medan is one of them, for example. I'll type it in the, it's MEEDAN.
Right.
Medan.
I mean, just to, as far as what we see at the clinic is the disinformation attacks against nonprofits or their sub-grantees and partners. A lot of them have like this intersection with digital security or lack of digital security, in that there'll be account breaches and leaked emails that are like taking it out of context, and you're using that or the adversary is using that in terms of like, look at these receipts. They're misappropriating funds, or if we remember the this was a tactic used against the DNC, where like, okay, look at these leaked emails. There must be a pedophile ring that is tied into this. So some of that like out of context stuff can be addressed by your digital security measures. And like Chris said, the intersection of harassment and disinformation, especially for a small organization, there's a lot that you can do that's going to address both. And we've also talked about having that like physical safety plan, where a disinformation attack can lead into harassment, and that can also increase your physical threats. Okay, moving on. The next upvoted question is, what types of nonprofits or activism do you think will face the highest threats leading up to or after the election?
I mean, honestly, I would say generally and historically, there's a lot of really marginalized communities more and more. Like if you're thinking about LGBT groups, racial organizations, immigrant organizations. So communities that have historically been marginalized, been over surveilled, been targeted, will keep being the ones that are honestly like at most risk, and probably mostly targeted around the election and after the election. And then after that category, I mean, really, they would be the most high-risk targets, I believe. And then after that, it would be anyone kind of working around organizing around the election. So specifically, like folks trying to get people to vote and to show up at the polls. So really, any organization that's kind of like grassroots organizations that are focused around like around the elections specifically. So that's kind of like the categories that at least I witnessed and I saw in the last election in 2016.
Chris, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that very much like what Sarah said, you know, marginal groups that are advocating for or made up of, you know, or both marginalized people, you know, trans or other LGBTQ folks, immigrants, you know, women, and there's so many, you know, out there fighting, and you know, we're certainly going to be targets. We have been targets, without a doubt, you know, under this administration and others. You know, for Trans Lifeline, our biggest actual threats are the far right. And certainly there was a rise of that since 2016. And I've done some mapping out, and no matter how this election ends up, they're either going to be emboldened or they're going to be angry that they lost, right? And they can lash out. They're going to be emboldened and strengthened, or they're going to lash out. And so we're preparing for, you know, all of those. And I think, again, this is why, you know, a network, a community is actually so important. And I hope there's, you know, I know there are steps being taken towards that, but I think we really need to continue this conversation elsewhere too, about how to support each other.
And so the last question we have is, how do we get in contact with you? And I would say if before the end of this session, we can put any contact information or websites in the chat window. And the next question is, are there groups that can help nonprofits, you know, beyond what we've already talked about? So we've mentioned Citizen Clinic is one initiative.
The Digital Security Exchange is another. And then if you're working internationally, you know, OTF, the Open Technology Fund, OTF, has a bunch of grants and help specifically around digital security and digital safety for international groups, not so much for domestic work, but for if anyone happens to be working on an international context. And honestly, other than that, I mean, I don't know if there are any good places to kind of just drop in and get help, but otherwise EFF is another amazing organization, so huge shout out to them. Access Now, but also a little bit more internationally focused. They have a digital security helpline and clinic, but Nicole in the chat, I see, says for abortion access and reproductive rights in the US, digitaldefensefund.org. So there are, I mean, if anyone has definitely that question and wants to find out more, feel free to message me and to hit me up separately, because I think it will depend on essentially like what you work on and the profile that you have of the organization that you're involved with and whatnot, and it will be a lot easier to kind of direct you in the right place, because there isn't really like one place that you can end up in and just kind of get information.
Right, and as Nicole mentioned in the chat, there are particular, you know, groups that help, you know, with particular domains of civil society, like Digital Defense Fund is amazing, providing support for abortion access and reproductive rights. And so you have the broader digital security assistance providers, but then you also have ones that are dedicated to specific topics. You know, it could be, you know, the Black community, Indigenous rights as well. And yeah, if anyone else has any other suggestions, So
there's also, sorry, just one last thing. There's also some like local groups, like you can seek out your local crypto party, and it's called the Crypto Party, and they have chapters in a lot of cities, and it's essentially a lot of like people that kind of come around and discuss things related to like internet security and safety. It's not always with a lens on civil society, but like you might end up finding folks like myself there, or like Chris. I don't know if you go to crypto parties, Chris, but I definitely have ended up at crypto parties. So it's also a good place to like meet other people that are kind of interested in this work, that can at least connect you to some groups and organizations.
yeah, and just because the rest of the attendees can't see it, Nicole from Digital Defense Fund says you can also think about the local Code for America brigades, which might have a digital security group. The Chai Hack Night in Chicago and Code for DC are both starting digital security training programs, and I'll copy and paste some of those. Okay, well. Yeah, if you have, if Sarah and Chris, if you have ways that you would like the attendees to get in contact with you, feel free to put it into the chat. That's really all the time that we have for now. Thank you so much, Sarah and Chris, for this discussion. Would either of you want to share any closing thoughts or announcements around upcoming projects? Is there anything that, audience members particularly could help you with as you're doing your own security work?
Honestly, nothing too much on my end, but definitely please, folks, feel free to hit me up on Twitter or by email. I'm always happy to take this discussion further and chat more.
Yeah, same. I dropped my email and my Twitter in the chat. Please, feel free to reach out anytime. If you are interested in helping Trans Lifeline, we're always looking for volunteers, and you can hit me up there too.
Okay, and my closing thoughts are make sure you use your multi-factor authentication as Sarah described. Lock down your accounts. That will save you so much trouble from all the different attacks that we've talked about today. Even if you do your risk assessment modeling, just do it. But if you're interested in learning more about Citizen Clinic, visit the website that I shared in the chat, or go to citizenclinic.io. We are there's a website on the screen now. If you're a student at UC Berkeley, we would love to hear from you and apply to be in our next semester's class. If you're at another university and you're thinking of standing up your own clinic, we would love to hear from you as well. And if you're an organization looking for help, or if you have grantees that could use some security assistance, also feel free to reach out. Again, thank you so much, Sarah and Chris. Thank you to the attendees for joining us. If you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, air quality is like close to the single digits. You need to get outside, enjoy it while you can. So get off to the Zoom call. And a special shout out to Rachel Wesson, our events planner from the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Chris, and Rachel, and everyone that's attended the call.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you to the Citizen Clinic for putting this together, and also all the help that you gave us at Trans Lifeline. So, highly recommend working with Steve and the team.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye.